Thank you so much, Elaine. There's obviously a huge amount one could say about Leon Trotsky. He lived an absolutely extraordinary life. He was a leading revolutionary. He was somebody who suffered imprisonment in that capacity, who had dramatic escapes from imprisonment, who lived in all different parts of the globe for many different reasons. He wrote extensively on a whole wealth of topics. He was known as the pen because he was such a brilliant writer. So I'm only going to be focusing on really some aspects of his thoughts, and I'm going to be talking about his political ideas, or even some aspects of his political ideas. I want to start by outlining some key themes that I'm going to be touching on in more depth in the course of this talk. And first of all, I want to start by saying that we have to understand that Leon Trotsky was a lifelong revolutionary. From joining his first revolutionary organization in his teens in Russia under the Tsarist dictatorship, under conditions in which that was illegal, until he was assassinated for being a revolutionary, age 60 in 1940. He was one of the leaders of the most significant revolution, I would argue, for working people to date, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 in Russia. And he was a brilliant Marxist thinker who applied the theoretical framework of historical materialism, and that's something that I'm going to try and unpack and explain, to develop working class struggle in response to the real problems that workers faced. And he was a brilliant communicator of those ideas, certainly in his writings, but also as an orator as well. And he brought this clarity of expression to his opposition to Stalin's dictatorship in Russia. He was therefore a very, very significant defender of the idea of what later an American Marxist, Hal Draper, described as socialism from below. This is a very important refutation, on the one hand, to the kind of right-wing argument about revolutions, this idea that as soon as we try to take control over our own lives and determine our own futures, that we automatically just mess that up, and it will end in tyranny. The idea that revolutionary organizations are secretly plotting despotism. A very important refutation to that, but also a refutation to Stalin's claiming of the revolutionary legacy. If you think of the kind of banners that were produced under Stalin, you probably know sort of red banners with the profile faces that go Marx, Engels, Lenin, and then Stalin, claiming himself as the kind of culmination of that tradition. Of course, all the people that preceded Stalin were dead by the time that he put them on the banner in front of him, which is quite important. Trotsky argued that Stalin's dictatorship was a gross distortion of the revolutionary socialist ideals of those people that he put before him. Revolutionary socialist ideals that were based on the idea of the self-emancipation of the working class. And as Trotsky was alive to see this, his politics couldn't be distorted by Stalin as something that kind of he could claim, and therefore Stalin decreed that Trotsky must be killed. And this was something that he obviously succeeded in doing in 1940. But Trotsky's critique of Stalin, which was based on a profound theoretical understanding and experience at the forefront of revolutionary struggle, also outlined alternative strategies to those that were disastrously pursued by the USSR, Russia, at home and abroad, including the USSR's inability to stop the rise of fascism. And although, as I'm going to explain, Trotsky's advice wasn't heeded, his analysis about the consequences of the USSR's strategy proved correct and are ones that we can draw upon. And so, really, I want to argue that this is why Trotsky matters. He's an outstanding defender of revolutionary socialism, whose theory was inextricably bound up with action and the practical advancement of the class struggle. And yes, there are, I'm going to express some disagreements with aspects of his analysis. I'm going to go into that. But I think it's important to say first that that analysis was developed under very, very difficult circumstances. Somebody who was often in exile and dealing with the distortions, not only of the kind of attacks by the capitalist powers, but also of Stalinist Russia. We now have the benefit of hindsight, but also I'm going to suggest that it's actually, we can make some criticisms based on the very framework that Trotsky himself developed. And so I want to draw very much on the method and the spirit with which Trotsky approached political questions. This idea about having political honesty about the problems that we face in order to develop strategies to achieve human emancipation. So my hay fever's kicking in, so I'm just going to grab a tissue before I continue with the second part. Okay, so in terms of talking about who Trotsky was and his place in history, he really was part of I think what we can see as a second generation of Marxists after Marx and Engels, who lived and wrote in the mid to late 19th century. Trotsky was 3 years old when Karl Marx died. He was 15 when Friedrich Engels died. Now, Marx and Engels, these sort of this earlier generation of Marxist revolutionaries had developed the framework of historical materialism to understand human history. This essentially the idea that the history of mankind is shaped by how we produce and reproduce our own existence under what social conditions. And sometimes this is kind of characterized as a very deterministic way of thinking about history, but I want to argue that it isn't at all. It's absolutely crucial for understanding the possibilities in any given historical moment. So, what are the kind of real historical forces? How do we live and how might we live? What are the contradictions in those systems? It was actually the absolute opposite of the approach taken by many contemporary socialists of Marx and Engels, who thought that the role of socialists was simply to proclaim, to be a sort of far-seeing prophet, and to be like the person who would announce that socialism is going to come about. It is rather deterministic. Instead, Marx had a much more subtle and sophisticated formulation, and it's there at the beginning of a book he wrote in London in 1852, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, in which he argued that mankind makes his own history, but not in circumstances of his own choosing. And there we have both the description of human agency in the world, but also of the fact that we are born into a world that we most certainly haven't chosen, and we have to start from that point. Now, this was a way of explaining the way in which societies had developed. If you read the Communist Manifesto, co-authored by Marx and Engels in 1848, that revolutionary year, they describe the way in which the bourgeois class developed under feudalism, and why there were tensions between a kind of very rigid feudal order and a rising sort of capitalist class. And what they were arguing was that under capitalism, the society under which they were living, this had actually created the conditions for the possibility of socialism. That this was the most productive epoch in human history. Never had there been the capacity to produce so much that everybody potentially could have more than enough. But also it had created a class of people who could create a socialist society. It had created a working class who had no stake in the continuation of capitalist society, or indeed of setting up a new oppressive form of society, who were organized collectively to produce profits for the capitalists, but who could also organize collectively, therefore, to achieve their own emancipation. Now, when they were writing this, this was based on their observations of Britain, which was the most advanced capitalist society of the time. Was the country that had industrialized fastest. But then for Russian Marxists, there was a question, of course. What were the prospects for socialism in a country that hadn't had what Marx and Engels described as a bourgeois revolution? His kind of sort of earlier phase of revolutions in the 1640s in England, in 1789 in France, in 1848, sort of, which, had very much been about establishing kind of constitutional forms of government, things like that. What were the prospects in a country that hadn't had that kind of revolution, where there was no parliamentary democracy, there was the Tsarist autocracy, a country that was overwhelmingly rural, that was dominated by a peasantry rather than a working class? And this was something that Russian Marxists were discussing with Karl Marx in the years just before his death, and that they were grappling with. It's also a question that Trotsky was grappling with. But he was grappling with those questions at the beginning of the 20th century in a revolutionary context, because in 1905, a revolution breaks out in Russia. And in that revolution, the working class actually played a very significant role. The 1905 revolution was started by a strike in St. Petersburg by iron workers at the Putilov works, an absolutely kind of massive industrial iron works. And when they went on strike, they were joined by workers in other factories, resulting in a big strike, 150,000 workers taking action. And there was a working class because industrial developments that had taken place elsewhere on the globe were exported to Russia in their most developed forms. So what Trotsky sees is that Russia didn't need to go through all of those intermediate stages that countries like Britain or like France had gone through in their industrialization. And this created a kind of strange situation where, yes, most of the Russian economy was mostly what was described as a backward economy, didn't look like an advanced capitalist country, but it also contained hypermodern elements within it. And this is what Trotsky described as combined development of Russia. Now, if we come back to this question of the bourgeois revolutions, of course, those revolutions weren't mostly fought by the bourgeoisie. These were revolutions that were fought in the majority by the poor, by workers, by peasants. They're described as bourgeois revolutions because they were primarily led by people of that class, and the demands benefited people of that class. The idea of sort of constitutional state, the idea of emphasizing individual liberty, so on and so forth. But in the 1905 revolution in Russia, what was seen was that the bourgeois class didn't want to lead that revolution. So they didn't take that kind of leading role. In fact, when they saw workers like at the Putilov works moving into action, they were absolutely far more terrified of that than they were by the continuance of the Tsarist autocracy. So there's not a bourgeois revolution really taking place. And what Trotsky also sees is that the working class in Russia weren't going to stop at those kind of bourgeois demands, but in fact were expressing their own and creating their own forms of organization. Perhaps most famously and importantly, the Soviet, meaning council, which were forms of direct democracy for the working class. This idea that you could send somebody to the council as your representative and then withdraw them as soon as they cease to represent your interests. Still a lot more sophisticated than what we have. And Trotsky was really, really involved in this process because he was elected chair of the St. Petersburg Soviet in the 1905 revolution, so absolutely knew this very, very well. And it's from this experience that Trotsky concluded that a working class revolution might break out, maybe not in the most advanced capitalist countries, but actually in one of the weakest countries, one of the countries where capitalism had its weakest hold. Lenin, who I'm going to come on to talk about, leader of the Revolutionary Bolshevik Party in Russia, argued that the chain could break at its weakest link. And it could therefore, the revolution in Russia might be able to skip the stage, a bit like the industrial development, might be able to skip stages in class struggle that were experienced in other nations if, in its leading role, it could trigger other workers' revolutions elsewhere that could materially sustain socialism in Russia. This is what Trotsky described as the permanent revolution. So here we can see Trotsky using a historical materialist framework. He's thinking about what are the material conditions in which this could take place, and also his conception of the Russian Revolution as necessarily internationalist and taking place in an internationalist framework. Now this becomes very, very significant, of course, in 1917, when the chain again breaks at its weakest link in the context of the World War, in which Russia was least able to bear the strain of fighting this kind of modern, the kind of horror of modern industrialized warfare. Absolutely, the casualties in terms of Russian society, runs into its millions, both those in the armed forces and of civilians. And in February, if we take the Russian calendar of the day, February 1917, a revolution breaks out, which overthrows the Tsar, the most autocratic despot in all of Europe, but doesn't really kind of resolve the situation about what kind of country Russia is going to be. There is a situation created that Lenin describes as dual power. On the one hand, there's the creation of a provisional government led by a prince. On the other hand, the poorest in Russian society reorganize the Soviets. And so we see these as places where workers seek their representation, peasants, those in the armed forces, so on and so forth. So we've got an unresolved situation. And this brings us back to the kind of question of the revolutionaries in Russia in this period. What were they saying about this? I've mentioned the Bolshevik Party, this revolutionary party led by Lenin. Many of the Bolshevik leadership argued that it would be a mistake in this circumstance to push for kind of second workers' revolution, based on a lot of the ideas about sort of society having to move through these stages. But Lenin disagreed. He disagrees in this document called the April Theses, and he argues for a second revolution. And it's at this point that Trotsky, who was previously in another organization, joins the Bolshevik Party in the kind of ferment of the Russian Revolution, and becomes really the kind of second leading figure in that party. This argument for the idea of the second revolution was based on the prospects for permanent revolution. And this was not something kind of utopian. This was based on what was taking place in Europe at the time. There were strikes. There were strikes and mutinies taking place in Britain and France. 1919 to 1921 in Italy were known as the Red Years, and most crucially and significantly in Germany. There's a revolution in 1918 that overthrows the Kaiser, and there are further attempts to create workers' revolutions in Germany in the 1920s. These are all crushed and ultimately fail, and this has a very detrimental effect, of course, on the Bolshevik Revolution, which becomes hollowed out. Because what you now see is the imperialist powers, particularly after the First World War, invading Russia on multiple fronts. It's in this capacity that Trotsky, as the leader of the Red Army, fights them off in kind of a brilliant campaign, which he describes amazingly in his autobiography. It means that the kind of vanguard, the most progressive workers, many of them are involved in the Red Army, are involved in repelling those invasions, lose their lives in that struggle. production has to be organized around war production in Russia. The working class on which this revolution had been based, many of them, if they're not in the Red Army, are fleeing the cities. The whole of the revolution is undermined by this, and it crushes the prospect for democratic life. So there was this question for the Bolsheviks about how to kind of make a strategic defeat so they could join a future revolutionary offensive. And this is when kind of elements of capitalism are introduced into the Russian economy, the new economic policy. Now, what I think is important to stress about this is that for Trotsky and for Lenin, these were temporary, strategic, and unfortunate necessities. Under Stalin later, these features, and much, much worse, the absolute crackdown on dissent, the gulags, the executions, the show trials, the torture, the forced collectivization, the production targets were defined and defended as socialism in practice. This is what people were told socialism was. And it wasn't. In order to do this, Stalin had to murder most of the old Bolsheviks. In his analysis of this, so we've got the kind of destruction of the Bolshevik Party people. Trotsky suggested this, called it a kind of degenerated workers' state, but I want to argue it wasn't even that. It adopted capitalist production not as strategic, but to compete economically as one of the great powers. I do think it is remarkable that given Trotsky's writing this, having been exiled from Russia by Stalin, knowing that Stalin wants to kill him, Stalin killed or kind of occasioned the deaths of all of Trotsky's children, that he was so careful and cautious in this analysis of Stalin's Russia. But also, another sort of way in which I want to explain that this, really was not revolution. It's not socialist society being constructed at all. I think about the people who were praising this. Many people who'd been terrified by the prospect of the October Revolution in 1917. Were full of praise for Stalin's Russia. If we think about the Fabians in this country, a sort of right-wing section of the Labour Party, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, leading figures of this. Sidney Webb had been in the Labour governments, wrote several books praising Stalin's Russia. They said the USSR is the most inclusive and equalized democracy in the world, and things like this. And probably, Trotsky had been a German spy and wanted to undermine the whole thing. These are the kind of things they were writing in their books. They wrote nothing about socialism here as the emancipation of the working class by the working class. And all of this idea that this was socialism taking place in Russia was justified by Stalin by the abandonment of permanent revolution, and instead the idea that there could be socialism in one country, diametrically opposed. And so what this also meant was that the foreign policy of the USSR was determined not by what was in the interests of the working class, but what was in the interests of the Russian state. So at a time when Stalin is introducing the first 5-year plan, this is justified by the idea that there is an ascending revolutionary struggle. This is the late 1920s, when the ascending revolutionary struggle had been decisively defeated and you're seeing the rise of fascism. But because there was this idea there was the ascending revolutionary struggle, Stalin is arguing with communist parties around the world that they should have nothing to do with any of the other organizations that are threatened by the rise of fascism, and should denounce those, social democratic parties as social fascists. Trotsky writes endlessly and vociferously against this as a completely counterproductive strategy that he argues is going to lead to the triumph of fascism. And his prescience in terms of this writing, his predictions, absolutely right, and is very, very useful material to read indeed. He was proved tragically right by this as Hitler came to power and crushed both the communists and also the social democratic parties. And when the USSR changed course utterly afterwards, it wasn't as Trotsky advised, but again, not driven by the interests of the working class or any kind of recognition of a mistake, but this time driven by a need to find allies after the rise of the Nazis. So what were created was not Trotsky's idea, this idea of the United Front, where you agree you find what you can agree on to oppose the Nazis, for example, and this is how you can generate mass mobilization against the rise of fascism, but popular fronts. So these were links made with much broader and much more conservative forces, state forces, for example. After the 1935 USSR pact with France, the Communist Party joins the French government and negotiates to get the 1936 strike wave in 1936 called off, which literally demobilized the working class in France at a time of rising fascism. Was very disorientating for people. And again, Trotsky writes on why this was a mistake and is proved right. Oh, I want to finish by saying that, we can see why around the world there was such loyalty amongst many working people to the USSR. Trotsky was struggling very much to try and to build organizations and networks of people who were listening to him. But Stalin was there claiming the legacy of a revolution that had inspired millions of working class people. There was this kind of mental fear that to criticize the USSR was to somehow give up on the hope of socialism, and also kind of wishful thinking that perhaps some of the worst stories were kind of just capitalist propaganda. But Trotsky provided a revolutionary analysis of the problems that defended socialism as a project of human emancipation. And I think it's now evident that he was absolutely correct, though perhaps he underestimated how rotten the USSR was. He placed, I think this is really important, a paramount importance for revolutionary strategy on a truthful assessment of where we are. In the 1930s, he said, revolutionary politics, as distinguished from conservative, cannot be built up on concealment. Why? Because we are seeking to engage the vast majority of people in the project of their own emancipation, not like conservatives in trying to keep the vast majority of people passive, inactive, apathetic, or demoralized. And so I don't think this is so important. There's no benefit today in kind of a sort of wishful thinking about the world in which we find ourselves. We have to be honest about the world in which we find ourselves. I think the idea of sort of pretending that China is this perfect utopian state is massively problematic. This is kind of maybe carrying on from some of the themes we were talking about earlier in the day. It denies the competitive nature of imperialism in the world today. It treats countries as monoliths with no class tensions of their own. And it's actually really unconvincing, I think, to most people who can see that that's not the kind of society that we want to fight for. We need theory, then, that can explain the world and therefore how to change it. For Trotsky, after the 1917 revolution, for him the party, this idea of party organization, a party of revolutionaries, became an indispensable way for achieving this. Sometimes the Revolutionary Party is called the memory of the class, in that the Revolutionary Party exists so that we don't need to relearn everything from scratch. The history of our class, we're not taught anywhere else. We don't learn that in school, we don't learn that from the media, but it can be taught and theorized and learnt from and tested in a party so that we can better engage with the problems that we face. A huge part of that memory of the class is contained in Trotsky's work, whose whole life was dedicated to its liberation. And that's why he's important today.